debating trigger warnings, the possible benefits of trigger warnings for professors, and a conversation with Professor Carol Swaim next on Campus Roundup. Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Duke, and this is the Campus Roundup at the College Fix. Our top story segment today focuses on trigger warnings, and in particular, a contract that I, an English professor at the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh, use in my classes. I'm joined today to talk more about this with one of my students, Andrea Toms. Andrea has taken at least 3 classes with me. Is that right?
Yes.
And so we're going to talk a little bit about the nature of the contract from a student perspective. And before we begin, then let's talk about this contract. It's really not a contract because it's not legally binding. But over the years, I've gotten really, really tired as a professor of students showing up to my classes with all sorts of preconceived notions that the progressive teachers have given them. I teach Shakespeare and Renaissance lit. I teach everything from the Bible to Dante to Milton. In other words, I teach the deadest of dead white males. I teach all of the great Western classics. And these kids are coming to my class now because we're training them very carefully to use these lenses, right? We put books in front of these students, but we don't ask them to read the books. We ask them to read the books through the feminist lens or the Marxist lens or the environmentalist lenses or even queer theory lenses, to read the books from the perspective of modern homosexuality, the theories that underpin modern homosexuality on our university campuses. So in other words, these kids are showing up and they know absolutely nothing about the 16th century, Shakespeare century. They know nothing about history. They can tell you nothing about the time period or the era or the worldview of people who lived 100 or 1,000 years ago. And yet, what they are bringing to class, instead of any sense of historical knowledge, is a very, very refined theoretical political sensibility. Well, if we're reading Shakespeare, a 16th century white male whose worldview was overtly Christian, then we're going to start from the premise, not going to give Shakespeare his say, we're going to start from the premise that we're dealing with racism and sexism and homophobia and transphobia and the destruction of the environment and imperialism and colonialism. And so what kids are doing is they're bringing preconceived notions in a very, very dangerous way to the books they read, and then they're not seeing what the authors are saying. They're only seeing what they've been trained to find. So I created this contract, and one of the main points of the contract, and I will throw a big shout out to the College Fix, they made this into a story. Jen Cabani wrote a story on this for the editor's corner of the College Fix. My first premise, Andrea, in these contracts is that, look, this is literature that was written hundreds, if not thousands of years before you students were born. And so consequently, their world is not our world. Their attitudes are not our attitudes. I absolutely guarantee my students at the opening that you are free to think and feel and say what you want. When I handed this contract out in your classes, the classes that you have taken with me, what were your initial thoughts about it?
Honestly, that it was a breath of fresh air. It was very comforting and reassuring and just overall reaffirming that I could express how I viewed a book without, feeling that I had to, like, as you have said, mirror my perspective based off the modern day view. While I think our ancestors in regards to like literature or, any plethora of ideologies that you want to throw out there, while it's important that they recognize that they didn't do everything right, but I think, like, how do you stem your knowledge without any foundation? I think foundation is critical and it's key, and that it's very important to understand, like, where our answers came from, like what mistakes they made, and how, like, we continue to grow and evolve from that.
I mean, you make a great point. I think everybody, rational person would agree that if you're studying history of any culture, right, it could be history of the African continent, history of native peoples, it could be the history of Western culture. The fact is that people have done bad things. Governments and individuals and religions and powerful people. That's the story of the human race. But what you said is interesting. It's one thing to know those things. It's another thing to primatize those things or to make those things the only things we look at. In your experience through your university, your 4 years at the university, how often did you find that you were really able to say what you wanted to say, to express honest opinions, as opposed to ones that had to be filtered in some way by the very progressive lenses that we see on these college campuses?
Often at times it feels very restricting. Like, I do think to a certain extent, like, those lenses do play a part, because again, it gives you another outlet of how to perceive a book. But I think to completely disregard the foundation that this book was set upon, then I don't think that's fair, and I don't think that's right, especially since, like, these historical authors, their language has carried on this far to this day and age. Like, it has stemmed over hundreds of years. So obviously what they had to say, it's relevant, it's important, and it's still, we can still relate to it.
in talking to your other students, other classmates across campus, what was the reaction that you could see? Because oftentimes what the students see are different than what we professors see. What was the basic reaction to the contract that I had these kids sign, and what was the attitude?
I think first, when meeting you and taking your class, there is like an initial shock because it's definitely outside the traditional scope of how you would, obviously your first day of class would go. But, for the most part, you haven't had anybody have any trouble signing it. Everyone has signed it. And I think, especially the kids who, for the most part, who have been resistant toward it at the end of the class, often thank you and are often, I guess their eyes are, often reopened by what they have learned in the class. Again, even if they don't agree with it, which is what you stress, we don't always have to agree with it, but simply just understand a different perspective of your own because, once upon a time, they used to be able to have an open discussion about things that you didn't disagree with before it became like all this animosity that is often associated with it. And from my perspective, from like my friends and my colleagues, from what I hear, it's like, again, it's like what I've mentioned before. It's refreshing to know that, you can discuss an idea, even if it's not necessarily, the right idea or the wrong idea. There are no labels placed on your ideas. It's simply a professor and your students having discussion about a book, which should be the definition of being an English major.
You began that argument, that response by arguing that a lot of kids are shocked when they first see it. And I think that's the real problem we have here, that the idea you go to college now to let the great authors dead, of all races and cultural backgrounds, the idea that we go to college to let the great authors dead speak to us is being completely overwritten by allowing those voices, having those original voices completely ventriloquized, speaking through these progressive ideologies. It really, in many respects, is the opposite of education. It's important that we know those lenses, but those lenses do not override the original text. To read more stories like this, visit thecollegefix.com, and don't forget to follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Time now for Expert Talk, where we take an opportunity to seek out the opinions of education specialists. Today, I'm really happy to be joined by Dr. Carol Swaim, author of Debating Immigration and a former professor at Vanderbilt University. Dr. Swaim, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hey, it's my pleasure.
Our topic today is trigger warnings, and I know you have strong opinions about this. My view of trigger warnings is that they're educational malfeasance. We should not be protecting kids from ideas. However, I myself have started using them because my own university cannot be trusted to protect me from frivolous complaints. Talk a little bit about your experience in the classroom.
Well, for the last few years at Vanderbilt, I taught a course on political culture, the impact of the communist movement on American national culture. And I used the first week of classes and also my syllabi to inform students that they had entered a politically correct free zone, meaning that I was giving myself permission to speak freely, and I gave them permission to speak freely about the range of ideas as long as they did not purposely try to insult me or anyone else. It worked very well. In fact, the class had waiting lists.
Amazing. Now, I do something similar. I make them actually sign a form that says that their free speech rights are dependent on the free speech rights of others. I have not yet had a single complaint from a student either. And so in your experiences, it worked really well. Kids were waiting to sign up for your classes. What kind of discussions did you actually have?
I mean, we read some of the leftist literature as well as more conservative readings, and students were exposed to ideas that some literature they had read before. One of the books I use is George Orwell's 1984. Most people read it in high school, but they had not read it alongside the Patriot Act. We read the Communist Manifesto, Saul Alinsky, as well as Hayek, and Michael Novak and some of the other more conservative authors, including my own work. And the students loved it. I think that the trigger warnings are wrong, and there's some evidence, scientific evidence, to suggest that it actually harms the students that are given the trigger warnings. And when you think about universities are supposed to be marketplaces of ideas. We're supposed to expose students to new material, and the process of grappling with ideas that might make you feel uncomfortable, that's how you grow.
Do you think the administration at Vanderbilt, where you last taught, would have supported you or would have stood by you if a progressive student had taken offense that you were reading sympathetically non-progressive writers?
I mean, I'm sure that, I mean, I don't know that the administration never approached me about anything that students had said in any of my classrooms. And so, as far as I know, none of the students that actually took courses with me ever complained. And I tend to be, and I've always been a professor that had an open door, and I enjoyed the students that held different views. And my classes had a lot of liberal students. They had students that were part of the LGBT community. We had great fun in the classroom, and I missed that quite a bit because I was exposing them to new ideas and material. We were engaging back and forth, and I think that the students that went through my classroom, that they actually graduated with a more open view towards a range of issues. And when they read some of that leftist literature that they had exposed to in other classes, when they read it in the context of history, their eyes were really opened.
I've had similar experiences that I don't consider my job to turn liberal kids into conservative kids at all. I consider my job is to show kids context. And you're right, what they're not getting in many classrooms is context for really extreme liberal arguments. So when they see that, the sort of scales fall from their eyes. I assume you probably have had some heated discussions in your classroom. How does that go? Have you ever had a kid come and complain to you afterwards that he or she felt threatened at all? Or how do you handle when the debate back and forth gets kind of hot and heavy?
I've had students that have told me that, when we were discussing immigration or some topic like that, that they felt uncomfortable. And a lot of times this may have had to do with anecdotes that other students recounted. And so, I mean, I just talked it out over a cup of coffee or in my office, and that's how I dealt with it. And so I encouraged the students. In fact, I told them that at some point each of them could expect to be offended about something, and so they were forewarned. They got that trigger warning that sooner or later I or someone else was going to offend them.
Do you feel that, being African American and female, that you have a little more latitude to discuss controversial topics? I get the same thing, being white and male. Kids hear things about my classes. I actually had this semester, a couple students went to my department chair and asked if they could avoid a required class because of what they heard Dr. Pesta talked about in his classrooms. Do you think you have a little more latitude because of who you are at a modern university, or is this something that is a universal?
Well, my classes were electives, and so if anyone wanted to avoid the class, they could. And so if they decide to sign up, I'm well known enough that they knew exactly what they were going to get. Now, the fact that I'm packaged as a senior citizen now, and I wear my hair natural, it should give me some latitude. It should have given me more latitude, but I think being a black conservative female, in my case, it ended up with me being treated like an old white man. And so I don't think I got the same protections I would have gotten had I been a liberal black, making people feel uncomfortable.
You probably got it worse for being African American and conservative. So the students, ironically, showed more maturity and independent thought than perhaps some of your colleagues did.
Yes, but I did have some students tell me that a few years ago I wrote an opinion piece about Islam that was considered controversial. In fact, it was. It generated some protests, again, from students that had not been in my classes. But I had a black student tell me that that opinion piece would not have been offensive if it had been written by a white male. But the fact that I was a black woman saying these things, they were more dangerous.
Dr. Carol Swaim, we really appreciate your time today and your insights. To read more stories like this, visit thecollegefix.com, and don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook. From a pedagogical perspective, trigger warnings are educational disaster. You're basically setting up a culture where kids are proactively deciding what they will and won't be offended by, and then going on a hunt and seek to find them in texts that you assign as a professor. On the other hand, from a professorial standpoint, as bad as they are for students, given how litigious our students have become, they're actually somewhat beneficial. I can put trigger warnings all over my first day's class and say, hey, if you're going to be bothered by ideas you don't like, if ideas are going to make you break down and cry, if you don't want to be exposed to ideas you disagree with, then maybe you ought to leave. It's one more way that we professors can indemnify ourselves from this really squishy, sensitive snowflake culture that we've bred on college campuses. The biggest problem I have with trigger warnings, however, is the fact that the left controls them. I have never had a kid ever come to me in 25 years of teaching to say to me, I was triggered by too much liberalism, or gee, feminism has triggered me, or son of a gun, I don't like Marxist economics. I think about all the people that have died in the name of socialism, and I don't like Marx. I've never had a kid come to me. These kids are always triggered by Christianity or traditional values or patriotism or viewing American history through a supportive lens. Those are the things that trigger our kids. And as long as the left is in control of trigger warnings, they will use them in a very, very politicized way. And that's The Final Fix. I'm Dr. Duke, and we'll see you next time.